The United States has been has had been the United States has long been a holdout among the Western democracies, uniquely and perhaps even suspiciously devout. From 1937 to 1998, church membership remained relatively constant, hovering at around 50. I'm sorry, hovering at about 70%. Then something happened. Over the past 2 decades, the number has dropped to less than 50%, the sharpest recorded decline in American history. Meanwhile, the people known as the knowns, like the nuns, meaning they have basically meaning atheists, people like me, agnostics, and those claiming to have no tie to any one religion, have grown rapidly, and today they represent a quarter of the population. But if secularists, um, but if secularists had hoped that religiosity would make far more what they call rational politics and drain to face inflaming passions, they are likely disappointed. As Christianity's hold in particular has weakened, ideological intensity and fragmentation have risen. The American faith, it turns out, is as fervent as ever. It's just that what was once religious belief has now been channeled into political belief. Political debates over what America is supposed to mean have taken on the character of theological disputations. Um, this is what religion without religion looks like. Not so long ago, I could people could somebody could comfort American audiences with a contrast. Whereas in the Middle East, politics is war by other means, and sometimes it's a literal war. Politics in America was less extensionally fraught. During the Arab Spring, in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, the debates out there weren't about healthcare or taxes. They were, with sometimes frightening intensity, about foundational questions. But what does it mean to be a nation? What is the purpose of the state? What is the role of religion in public life? American politics in the Obama years had its moments of ferment, like the Tea Party and tan suits, but it was still relatively fucking boring. We didn't realize how lucky we were. Since the end of the Obama era, debates over what it means to be American have become suffused with a fervor that would be unimaginable in debates over, say, the Belgianness or the meaning of Sweden. It's rare to hear someone accused of being un-Swedish or un-British, but un-American is a common slur that's slung out by both the Democratic side and the Republican side against the other. Being called un-American is like being called un-Christian or un-Islamic, a charge akin to heresy. This is because America itself is almost a religion, as the Catholic philosopher Michael Novak once put it. Particularly for immigrants who come to their new identity with the zeal of the converted, the American civic religion has its own founding myth, the prophets and processions, as well as its scripture, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Federalist Papers. In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. had wished that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. The very idea that a nation might have a creed, a word associated primarily with religion, illustrates the uniqueness of American identity as well as its predicament. The notion that all deeply felt conviction sublimated religion is not new. Abraham Kuyper, a theologian who served as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands at the dawn of the 20th century when the nation was in the early throes of secularization, had argued that all strongly held ideologies were effectively what they call faith-based, and that no human being could survive long without some ultimate loyalty. If that loyalty didn't derive from traditional religion, it would find expression through secular commitments such as nationalism, socialism, or democraticism. The political theorist Samuel Goldman calls this the law of the or the he calls it the law of the conservation of religion. In any given society, there is a relatively constant and finite supply of religious conviction, and what varies is how and where it is expressed. No longer, no, no longer explicitly rooted in white, the Protestant dominance understandings of the American creed have become richer and more diverse. But also it has become more fractious. As the creed fragments, each side seeks to exert the exclusivist claims over the other. The conservatives believe that they are faithful to the American ideal, and the Democrats are betraying it when it's the other way around. But the Democrats believe with equal certitude that they are the ones that are faithful to the American idea, and that the Republicans are betraying it. Without the common ground produced by a shared external enemy, America had during the Cold War and briefly after the September 11 attacks, what they call mutual antipathy grows, and each side becomes less intelligible to the other, and too often the most bitter divides are those within the families. But no wonder the newly ascendant American ideologies having to fill the vacuum where religion once was are so device. They are meant to be device. On the Democrat side, the woke take religious notions such as original sin, atonement, a ritual, and excommunication, and repurpose them for secular ends. The adherents of wokeism see themselves as challenging the long dominant narrative that emphasized the exceptionalism of the nation's founding, whereas religion sees the promised land as being above the invisible ferryman's kingdom. The utopian Democrats see it as being ahead in the realization of a just society here on Earth. After the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in September, droves of mourners gathered outside the Supreme Court, some kneeling, some holding candles as though they were at the Western Hall. On the right, the adherents of a Trump-centric ethno-naturalism still drape themselves in some of the trappings of organized religion, but the result is a movement that often looks like a tent revival stripped of Christian whiteness. Donald Trump's boisterous Klan rallies were more focused on blood and soil than on the invisible ferryman. That Trump himself played both savior and martyr, and basically failed at both. And it is easy to marvel at the hold that a man so imperfect can have on his sycophants. But many on the Republican side find solace in conspiracy cults such as QAnon, and that tells a religious story of earthly corruption that were redeemed by an invisible ferryman-like force. Though the United States wasn't founded as a Christian nation, Christianity was always intertwined with Americans' self-definition, and without it, the Americans, conservatives, and Democrats alike no longer have a common culture upon which to fall back on. Unfortunately, the various strains of wokeism on the Democratic side and the Trumpism cannot truly fill the spiritual void. But what the journalist Murtaza Hussain called America's God-shaped hole. But religion in part is about distancing yourself from the temporal world, with all its imperfection. At its best, religion confers relief by withholding final judgments until another time, perhaps until eternity. The new secular religions unleash dissatisfaction not towards the possibilities of divine grace or justice, but toward one's fellow citizens who become embodiments of sin, like deplorables or enemies of the state. This is the danger in transforming mundane political debates into metaphysical questions. Political questions are not metaphysical. They are of this world, and this world alone. And some days are for dealing with your insurance documents or fighting in the mud with your political opponents. The political philosopher Samuel Kimbrell recently said, but that there are also days for solemnity, or fasting, or worshiping, or feasting, and things that remind us that the world is bigger than itself. But absent some new religious awakening, and what are we left with? One alternative to American intensity would be a world-weary European resignation. Violence has a way of taming passions, at least as long as it remains an active memory. In Europe, the terrors of the Second World War are not far away. But Americans must go back to the Civil War for violence of comparable scale, and for most Americans, the violence of the Civil War bolsters rather than undermines. The national myth of perpetual progress, the war was redemptive. It led to a place of promise, a place where slavery could be abolished and the nation made whole again. And this, at least, is the narrative that makes the myth possible to sustain. For better or worse, the United States really is nearly one of a kind. France may be the only country other than the United States that believes itself to be based on a unifying ideology that is both unique and universal, and avowedly secular. The French concept of l'État requires religious conservatives to privilege being French over their religious commitments when the two are at odds. And with the rise of the far right and persistent tensions regarding Islam's presence in public life, the meaning of l'État has become more controversial. Most French people still hold firm to the country's founding ideology. More than 80% favor banning religion displays in public, according to one recent poll. In democracies, without a pronounced ideological bent, which is most of them, nationhood must instead rely on a shared sense of being a distinct people that was forged over centuries. It can be hard for any outsider and any immigrant to embrace a national identity that's steeped in ethnicity and history when it was never theirs. Take take the post-war Germany, for example. Germanness is considered a mere fact, an accident of birth rather than an aspiration, and because shame over the Holocaust is considered a national virtue, the country has at once a strong national identity and a weak one. There is pride in not being proud. So what would it mean for, say, the Muslim immigrants to love a German language and culture that's tied to a history that is not theirs, and indeed a history that many Germans themselves hope to leave behind? An American who moves to Germany, lives there for years, and learns the language remains an American, which is also known as an expat. If America is a civil religion, it would make sense that it stays with you unless you renounce it. As Jeff Gedman, the former head of the Aspen Institute in Berlin, described, you can eat strudel, speak fluent German, adapt to the culture, but many will still say of you, "Ihr hat einen Deutschen Pass." He has a German passport, but no one starts calling you a German. But many native-born Americans may live abroad for stretches, but few immigrate permanently. Immigrants to America tend to become American, and the immigrants to other countries from America tend to stay American. The last time anybody came to the United States after being abroad, the officer at Dulles Airport in Virginia glanced and looked and said, "Welcome home." For any custom officer, it went without saying that the United States was anybody's home. In the Light of What We Know, a novel by the British Bangladeshi author Zia Haider Rahman, who's the protagonist, an enigmatic and troubled British citizen named Savar, is envious of the narrator, who's American. If any immigration officer at Heathrow had ever said "Welcome home," Savar says, "I would have given my life for England, for my country, there and then. I would kill for an England like that." And the narrator reflects later that this was a bitter plea. Embedded in his remark, there was a longing for being a part of something. The force of the statement came from the juxtaposition of the two apparent extremes. What Savar was prepared to sacrifice on the one hand, and on the other, what he would have sacrificed it for. The casual remark of an immigration official: when Americans have expressed disgust with their country, they have tended to frame it as a fulfillment of a patriotic duty, rather than its negation. As James Baldwin, the rare American who did leave for good, put it, "I love America more than any country in the world, and exactly for this reason I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." Americans who dislike America seem to dislike leaving it even more, but witness all those Democrats not leaving the country every time a Republican wins the squadroncy, despite their promises to do so, and Americans who do leave still find a way, like Baldwin, to love it. And this is the good news of America's creedal nature, and many provide at least some hope for the future. But is our love enough? Conflicting narratives are more likely to coexist uneasily than to resolve themselves. The threat of disintegration will always lurk nearby. On January 6th, that threat became all too real when an insurrectionary violence came to the capital, and what was once in the realm of dream politic now had physical force. And what can unity possibly mean after that? Can religiosity be effectively channeled into a political belief without the structures of actual religion to temper and postpone judgment? There is a little sign so far that it can, but if matters of good and evil are not to be restored by an omniscient, invisible ferryman in the future, then Americans will judge and render punishment now. We are a nation of believers. If only Americans could begin believing in politics less fervently, realizing instead that life is elsewhere, but this could come at a cost, because to believe in politics also means believing we can and probably should be better. In history, it has begun. The author of Bruno, some guy named Bruno, Portugal's former empire, or your minister basically, marvels that perhaps alone among all contemporary civilizations, American regards reality as an enemy to be defeated. This can obviously be a bad thing. Consider our ineffectual fight against the coronavirus. but it can also be an engine of rejuvenation and creativity, but it may not always be a good idea to accept the world as it is. Fantasy-like belief is something that humans desire and need. A distinctive American innovation is to insist on believing even as our fantasies and dreams drift further out of reach. And this may mean that the United States will remain unique and torn between this world and the alternative worlds that secular and religious Americans alike seem to long for. If America is a creed, and then as long as enough citizens say they believe, the civic faith can survive. Yeah, I doubt that. Like all other faiths, America's will continue to be a fragment and divide, and still the American creed remains worth believing in, and that may be enough, but if it isn't, then the only hope might be to get down on our knees and pray, which I won't do, because, for me, I'm all in favor of a world without a God, so I can care less.